Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the Transfiguration of our Lord, or Transfiguration Sunday, for the week of March 2nd, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited that now we are at the tipping point, the week that starts to make things move. As you know, later this week, we will then have Ash Wednesday, and so this movement into Lent, we are getting the last year of Epiphany, and so this movement, this change, as we are going into a reflection stage, we get this last big hurrah, this last big moment of reminder of who God is and how strong and who God is to us. And in doing that, this reminder of as we go through the next 40 days after that and the difficulties and self-reflection, it can lead to us forgetting this, but this is this last reminder of this is who our God is. And it's so empowering, but also powerful. And it's also one of those things that we often forget. And I think this week, as we will get into a little bit with some of our scientific discussion, I think there's some pretty unique things that we need to talk about. But before we do that, let's look back to last week's question, which was, where are we allowing things to be turned over? And that's a deep and hard question, because I think in our lives, there's a lot of times where that does happen. And sometimes that's really difficult. Moving into the next phase of life, moving into a new phase of life is sometimes really difficult, really hard. But yet, when I think about it, I look at how trees do it every year. They go through a dormancy period where they are healing and preparing for the year. We then have a sprouting season where things are getting ready to grow and the changeover. Then we get the growing season and the season to start shutting things down, to start self-reflecting, to start healing. And I think there is a rhythm and beauty to that I think a lot of times we as people in the modern society miss, because we're not used to aligning ourselves with that type of cycle. And I think at times it is important for us to be able to recognize that there are times and seasons for different things within our lives. And moving on from that can be sad, can be hard, but it's also recognizing that's partially how God has designed things. It's not like Jesus was here for eternity. Jesus was here for a season. Jesus was here for a time. And so I think at times we need to be able to look at that and think about that ourselves and being able to bring that forward. And sometimes God moves quickly and sometimes God moves slower. And I think that's the hard thing with this at times as we are digging into and thinking about this. And so especially here as we are kind of in this pivot point week, I think it's a really interesting thing to be thinking about and contemplating, especially as we're looking at these texts as we're moving into Lent very quickly. So let's just jump into the text this week. The Old Testament reading is from Exodus chapter 34, starting at verse 29 to 35. This is one of those, we got to quickly give a quick summary, but Moses has been going up to Mount Sinai, and this is one of those times where Moses has then been up there for an extended period of time, and he comes down with the 10 Commandments. And in doing this, we are told multiple times, because of Moses being in the presence of God, his face is glowing, his skin is glowing. There is a veil that he is putting on when he is talking to the other people because of how much he is glowing and bright, and will remove the veil when he is talking directly to God. And this is then the beginnings of a new covenant with his people. This is what I am expecting from you. This is how we're going to connect. And I think this is a really important pivot point, but I think it also ties into the gospel text this week in a real direct way. But I think it's these iterations of us understanding how God is trying to get closer and closer to us. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 99, all 9 verses of it. And as you would expect, this is a praise psalm. This is a psalm that recognizes the power of God, recognizing that in this power that God has, we recognize the strength, and this should be an all-encompassing overpowering type of thing where we are giving everything and it's just an all-encompassing type of thing. And then referencing, starting in verse 6, how what Moses and Aaron were going through when they're connecting directly with God, and how God has continued to lead God's people. And in doing that, that has allowed us to continue to recognize who we have as a God, that God is wanting to be with us and continues to work with us. And yet we also see the strength of what God has continued to do for God's people. The epistle text or second reading is from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 to chapter 4, verse 2. This then is this recognition of how we in time, at times, put a veil between us and God. And what Paul is getting at is there will come a time when that veil is removed, that we are able to be with God in God's full glory face to face, nothing hiding it. This allowing us to be able to fully be who God is allowing us to be and fully be encompassed by the awe and power and strength of who God is. And so if that is the truth that we are believing, we should be striving toward that, in that we are preparing ourselves for that, that we are walking toward that, that we are recognizing that this is something that is coming and preparing, but also taking the steps so that we are able to acknowledge that and not denying it. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36, and optionally 37 through 43a. This is Luke's version of the Transfiguration. So Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain to pray. And while they're up there, they see two additional men of Moses and Elijah, the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. And Peter then is overwhelmed and gets to the point where they're needing to sleep. But upon this, he wakens again and then is stating, well, why don't we make three dwellings? One for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. There is this change where suddenly then we hear the voice of God say, this is my son, my chosen, listen to him. And Jesus is by himself. So then they go down the mountain and they're trying to understand this. But meanwhile, a person comes up to them and is asking to heal their child. A spirit has seized the man. And Jesus then not only then heals the man and casts out the demon that is within him, but then also goes on and heals the boy as well. And this is, again, this astonishment of what is happening. We get God stating, listen to him, trust who this is. And then we have this miracle of Jesus doing it immediately as coming down the mountain, recognizing the power of who Jesus is, that there is no doubt in this moment that this is something the world has not ever seen before. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction and ways of looking at these texts. I find it extremely helpful. And if you haven't checked out the resources over at workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. Their back catalog is phenomenal, but there's a lot of great resources over there to help you get prepared for the upcoming week. I'd also highly recommend checking out the revised common lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but along with the art, prayers, hymns, colors, and daily devotions. Remember, whether you are in the pews on Sunday morning or in front of the pews on Sunday morning, there's always things that we can be doing to prepare for worship. So I'd highly recommend using this resource. There's some amazing things over here to really help you mentally get in a place to prepare to really be able to absorb the text then on Sunday morning. So if you haven't checked out the revised common lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that also. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that goes through a lot of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies that can be brought into the weekly preaching, along with some different ideas and things to be thinking about, especially more if you're thinking more of an eco-friendly type of faith. If you enjoy listening to me for a half an hour each week, going through these texts and talking about it from a scientific perspective, I know you're going to enjoy, at minimum, having these homilies coming out of in weekly reflections for the weekly lectionary week after week. But I'd highly recommend checking out both the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. That'll be the first link down in the show notes. What we have with the Transfiguration is it's a moment where God really flexes God's power. And this is also a moment where we are getting confirmation of things. And there's a vast change. We see it in the Old Testament text of Exodus, where now Moses is coming down off the mountain and is giving the 10 Commandments to the people of Israel to be able to help in following in the footsteps of who God is wanting his people to be. And we then get the psalm acknowledging this power. Then we get to see Jesus go through and see this power and continue on with the healing. And Paul reminding us that we will be going through that as well. These are vast changes. Jesus being able to show the power of what Jesus is doing and acknowledging then with his few super close trusted disciples this, being able to witness this and recognize this and being able to hear the voice of God saying that this is my chosen. Listen to him. Acknowledging you're going to hear things but also see things that are incredible. It's not just the sight of things, it's also the words that are being spoken. There has been a major breakthrough in our understanding on how our bodies work within the last couple years. And it's been a major question that we know what it's doing, but we weren't understanding how it got there. And I think when we start recognizing this and acknowledging this and thinking about this, it also helps us to understand the character that we are seeing here in the Old Testament and in the gospel text of that this is much different and a relationship that God has that is very instantaneous in certain ways. And that is, let's talk a little bit about myelin on your neurons. So neurons are how your body communicates back and forth, and being able to take your sensory things that are you're touching, you're feeling, you're seeing, you're using your senses, and being able to communicate them with the brain and being able to react back and forth. The faster that moves, the faster you can be able to react. And it's one of the things that makes 99.9% of invertebrates so different than our invertebrates, which would be something like slugs, worms, and snails. When we think about these creatures, vertebrates have a central nervous system. We have a backbone. We have a spinal cord that allows for very fast transition. You accidentally put your hand on a hot fireplace. You feel it. Your nerves say, remove it. You move your hand back. And this is all so fast. How fast the brain can communicate that back and forth. It's in microsections that we are able to do that and react that way. And it's one of the ways that makes us amazing vertebrates, being able to do things so much faster in ways that other parts of creation just can't, like we talked about with slugs, worms, and snails. One of the things, though, that has been a mystery with this whole thing, and basically with us being vertebrates, let me rewind. What myelin is over our neurons is basically an insulator. So think of it like the outside of an extension cord. You don't grab it even when it's plugged in, but you don't feel the electrical charge going through that electrical cord. You have an insulator that is preventing you from feeling that electrical pulse going through that, feeling that electrical charge going through there. That insulator helps make it so that you can handle it, and it also helps to prevent the loss of that electrons. It's holding that stuff in. It's allowing for easier transmission so that it's more efficient in what it has to do. Myelin acts in a very similar way to our neurons. It acts as an insulator to allow for very, very, very lightning fast transmission of these sensory things back and forth and being able to communicate them to the brain. This in comparison to our invertebrates that don't have this. So as we are walking through this, one of the things that has been a question is, when did this come up in the fossil record? And when we've gone through the fossil record, it's been very fast and abrupt, that somewhere around 500 million years ago, that suddenly this happens in vertebrates. There's not really a trace of evolution. This is more like bang, it happened and everybody had it. And so it's, what is this? What happened that allowed all these vertebrates suddenly to have this? So they've gone into the genetic code and remembering our DNA, there's a lot of our DNA that is just, how do we fight off different viruses, bacteria? How do we handle different things? What we have found is that the myelin sheath that we have, and granted, I'll talk about it in a second, we have two different types. But the myelin sheath that we have comes from a virus. It is leftover remains of a virus. We can see it in the DNA and that it's gotten embedded within our DNA. So let's think about this for a moment. A virus that was, again, we've talked about before, viruses are kind of weird, that they are a living thing, but they're not a living thing. They have their own DNA, but they need some type of host to be able to live. And it's a kind of a weird in between. But a virus went into vertebrates, causing issues. And as the body then was breaking down the virus, it left some of its DNA remains. And in doing that, was able to embed it within vertebrates' DNA, which allowed for suddenly lightning fast transmission of our neurons back and forth. And we've been able to, in a lab, actually figure out the exact protein that is happening here, what they're calling retromyelin, that allows for this to fail. If you are blocking that protein, suddenly the nervous system is not working and it largely fails because we're designed to have this myelin for lightning fast transmission. So here we had a virus that suddenly came in and suddenly bang, vertebrates across the board very quickly suddenly all had this. And it separates us from our invertebrates outside of lamprey, which lamprey are their own weird vertebrate in and of itself, but every other vertebrate has this characteristic. And it allows for us, like we stated, to have these fast reaction times. It allows us to be able to interact and move in a much different way than invertebrates do within our ecosystem. This change was fast and abrupt, specifically when we're looking at typical evolutionary scale. To suddenly have it where it's not here and then here does not typically happen. It is not following what we typically understand. And we can see that, okay, cool, there was a virus infection that went through vertebrates and it left traces, and suddenly that was a characteristic that allowed for breeding, and it was very quickly that suddenly all of them had this because of the benefits that came from it. When we see in Luke's text the transfiguration here, we have the images of both Elijah and Moses on the mountain, the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. And they had done amazing things for leading God's people and helping connect God's people to God. But now we have this moment of we are in the middle of this lightning fast transition. We know it on this side of the cross that it's a 33-year lightning fast transition. That suddenly we don't have to have a prophet in that way to connect directly with God. We had God embodying God's self in the form of human as Jesus, living, walking, and being amongst us. And after the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension, that this changed our relationship, that it is a direct line, this fast communication, this Myelin-like communication back and forth with God. And Moses had done that before, that here is the commandments to help obey so that I'm not getting mad with you all the time. That was a monumental shift in the relationship that the Israelites had with God to that point. We had a major upgrade. Now, like I stated, the cool thing with Myelin is we don't just have one. We have two different types. We have Schwinn cells for myelin, which covers the majority of our body. But we have olictandrin cells, which are in the brain, which then are specialized again for these reactions and being able to send things back to the body. We have been able to have specialization within that to be able to maximize this. When we think about how Jesus coming and living in and amongst us and being able to walk and interact with us, it expedited what we understood of God directly. So when Paul is then talking about, we then have to be prepared that this is not the final upgrade. The final upgrade is that we are seeing the whole glory of God face to face, no veil, nothing is separating us. We aren't living in this world. We are in God's world. There is no limitations of a human body being put on us. Like Jesus went through to be able to connect with us. It's going to be more instantaneous than that. And I think this helps us to understand God does move sometimes what seems to us in very slow ways, but I think it's also us recognizing that God can also move in extremely quick ways and drastically change things. This showing that this virus came in, which looked to be something that could potentially destroy, has suddenly become something that is vital to our existence today. Does that not sound familiar to what we will be going through over the next 45 days? That something that was meant to stop a movement, to destroy, led to something much greater that we are still following after 2,000 plus years later. We need to understand this, that this is the reality of how our God works. That God was able to take invertebrates and make a subsect vertebrates like that, based off of a virus that was looking to destroy, that left remains behind, that got embedded within us, that was then moved to make us stronger, faster, being able to live out the calling that God has for us even more. And I think that's something, as we are moving into this Lenten season, we need to recognize. That yes, over the next 45 days, there are going to be times that we feel like we are distant from God. It feels like Easter is a mile away, and it's not. It feels like the resurrection and going through Holy Week and the trials and tribulations of what that will bring feels exhausting, but it isn't. It's very quick. We need to understand that God can and does change things at times in a moment's notice. And I think that's where we then have to remember the psalm and recognize that we are following after a God, and thus we need to acknowledge the power of God. So the question I have for you this week is, where have you seen God make lightning fast changes in your life? Where have you seen God make lightning fast changes in your life? I want to hear these stories, because I think as we talk about them and think about them and acknowledge them, I think we will see more and more that this is a God who does play the long game, but also God who does play the instant game as well. And I think this is a part of God's character we don't talk about enough. And when we're seeing it literally embedded with how our body reacts and how our body functions, to be able to sense the world and be able to process the world, I think that's something worth noting, that this was a fast and rapid change. And then we look at how Jesus coming was a fast and rapid change, and just as fast as Jesus was here, suddenly Jesus is gone. We have to recognize it, and I think in doing that, we start seeing how precious life really is. And I think we get to see the awe and wonder on how this goes on in the world. I think there's a lot of things right now within the world that we're all feeling is moving very quickly, very fast. But I think we also have to recognize that there's certain things that have happened that are probably even faster that God has done. And we have to trust and follow and obey. And sometimes that's easy, and sometimes that's difficult, and sometimes it also means talking to God about things. But I think it's also this recognition that God doesn't always play slow and play, this is where I'm guiding you in life. There's sometimes that God really does move quickly. And I think the faster we acknowledge that, the faster we see that, the more we can actually understand ourselves. And the more that I think we can also acknowledge what we are getting into here in the Lenten season that's literally knocking on the door. So I think that's something I know for me that I want to spend some time reflecting on this Lenten season. Because I think if that's the case, that the world can change so quickly and drastically, and God can be part of that, I think then it also means for me that sometimes I need to actually slow down too, and not necessarily try running, recognizing that God can keep up, and I can take a breather sometimes too, and reflect, and think, and talk with God, get ready, and then go back into the race to where God is calling me next. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.